You want to go into that? No.
No.
Okay, so we should be live. Just waiting
Great.
for it to start up on YouTube.
I should have brought a
There we
pen.
go.
That wasn't good. You want to put your pen here? We can share it.
Okay,
Thanks.
you're welcome.
Just waiting for the first. Just behind you, get this chair out of the picture. It's much better. So now we've got 3 viewers, actually 2, including myself.
Ooh.
So
So when do you actually start? Do you just start or?
well, we'll wait until other people join. So right now there's one person watching, and
Is that you?
no, not now. There's 2 people in addition to myself. So you see down here at the bottom where it says 3
You
viewers.
have 2 others beside you.
So yeah, I'm one of those viewers, and so there's a. Let's see if I can log in as. See if there's anybody else who is waiting.
Anna is on.
Okay.
I wonder why the light makes the high-pitched whine.
It's so strange that I don't hear it because,
You're so blessed.
I mean, well, it's funny.
It's
I
an
mean,
extremely high-pitched whine.
it's odd that I don't hear it even with these on in my ears. What happens if I take them out? No, just my normal. I feel like I'm in a soundproof room with these not in.
Is that from?
Headphones, concerts.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah.
So those rock and roll concerts you went to?
Oh yeah, and wearing headphones when I was a teenager and blasting music. I'm certain that's what it is. I mean, it's not as if it's ever been traced, but I knew something was wrong. Teddy was still here when you first joined,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and you remember how softly she talked.
Right.
She could be sitting where you were talking to me, and I couldn't hear her.
Wow.
That's how soft. And I also noticed that my wife has a tendency when she talks for her sentences to drop off like this and then get to the point that if she had her back to me and she was doing that, I couldn't hear a word. So I finally went and had my hearing tested, and it turns out that everything that are in the softer ranges, I just totally lost it completely.
Wow.
They showed me the graph of both ears, and you could see where the drop happened in both. So it was really funny because I got these the end of January 2010, And that was when we were still doing full newsroom meetings every day in the middle of the newsroom. And the first day I had these in, somebody, I think it was Mike Bowman, was saying something behind me, and I just turned around and said, I heard that.
Awesome.
So
I'm going to go ahead and have a. I'll pop up there and tell anyone who's watching that there should be a link on the YouTube page to join in case people are sitting there waiting. So
okay.
Because people sit on YouTube and wait. They never do. That just doesn't happen on YouTube. You're already watching the latest kitten video.
No, probably the latest 3 or 4
Yeah.
at this point.
Exactly. There's no such thing as waiting on YouTube.
Right.
I remember we said in Pakistan, YouTube was banned.
Right.
And the best time was going to Afghanistan because YouTube was not banned in Afghanistan.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and also Pakistan only had a 2G network and Afghanistan had a 3G network.
Wow.
So Afghanistan was like way advanced, more advanced than Pakistan. So every time I went to Afghanistan, I'd be like, yes! And I'd get onto YouTube and I'd watch hours of Billy Connolly and just, have videos of Janis Joplin.
No, you needed to treat yourself.
Yeah, and I remember writing to someone saying, I'm sitting in Kabul, listening to Janis Joplin, my life is good. It's just, what do you mean your life is good? So you try sitting in Islamabad with no YouTube for year after year, forget it.
Wow.
Yeah, but what was funny was when I went to a school and I was talking to young kids like 10, 12 years old, and because they loved YouTube.
Right.
All the 10 and 12-year-olds had workarounds. They were telling me how to work around the Pakistan ban on YouTube. It was just so funny.
That's great.
They were like, have you tried this? You should really try that. Don't you have a VPN?
Oh, I love that.
It was fantastic. It was really
fabulous.
good. Yeah. I did a story on that. I did a story on the kids and the kids complaining about not having YouTube because they learned a lot.
Right.
Even for example, the more nerdy kids were using YouTube to do, find out about science, and I'm sure they were using it for everything else.
Right.
But they were like genuinely sort of feeling that they were cut off from the world.
Wow.
And it was actually, and I certainly felt that way. And my workarounds never worked very well. I just couldn't make it work. That's very funny. But yeah, going to Afghanistan was always great.
I would have never thought there would be that wide a disparity.
There is, yeah. Only now is Pakistan just beginning to introduce 3G network.
Wow.
By now, Afghanistan's already focusing on trying to get 4G. And they've got more cell phone providers than Pakistan does.
Interesting.
It's amazing. They're much more active and involved, and yeah.
It's really interesting.
But maybe that's in Kabul, but the cell phone network is throughout the country, and there were less media restrictions in Afghanistan than there were in Pakistan. They started to have like visits to certain newspapers and so on.
Really?
Yeah, but overall, given if you look at how many journalists were killed in Pakistan and how many killed in Afghanistan, it's better to be in Afghanistan, which is just so ironic.
It's really weird because when I came here, the whole thought process was it was safer to be in Islamabad than it was to be in Kabul.
It's nicer and it's safer. I mean, I drove, for example, in Islamabad, I drove around by myself, and I would go out at night, and I felt okay. In Kabul, I went out at night also, but I wouldn't drive by myself. But I hired, I would take taxis. I took taxis in Kabul. The hotel had a sort of driving service, and I would take a car if I wanted to meet someone at dinner, and I would go out by myself at night and come back. But maybe that wasn't the most brilliant thing to do, but I did it, and I knew other women who were working in Kabul, so I sort of coordinated with them. How do you do this? How safe is this? Do you know this taxi service? And we all used that taxi service. All the women would use one particular car service that they felt safe with.
Mhm.
and that's what I used. But yeah, it's you know, it was interesting. I found Afghanistan really interesting. The thing with Afghanistan is you can't really travel out of the capital very much. Then it starts getting really hairy. I went once out, way out, up into anti-Taliban land, but an area where the Taliban had been.
Mhm.
And that was only after Ekram, who's the guy that he was calling, was like, when we were in the car, he was calling every 15 minutes. Are you okay?
Really?
He's checking with the driver. Is everything all right? You know, make sure as soon as we got to a police checkpoint, he said, make sure you clear with the police checkpoint. Ekram is amazing.
Yeah.
Ekram is one of the best people VOA has. And he was fantastic. So I was supposed to go to Jalalabad. We had coordinated with the cameraman to go to Jalalabad and do part of the election in Jalalabad. And I arrived really early in the office, and Ekram was like, no, I don't want you to go. He said, I called up my relatives in Jalalabad. They're saying the road isn't safe. I said, okay. You know, if that's your call, I'm going to respect it. But he was very, very good. He was amazing. One of the best ever.
That's what I've heard from Eric as well, and he was filling his acting director. So
he's just, but he takes very good care of the correspondents. Like he really watches out. Anytime I was out and about, and I would be out all day long, you know, filming in the streets, he would call the driver, usually every hour and a half. Where are you? Is everything okay? What's Sharon doing? So she's in the street. She's with the cameraman. She's okay. So, okay.
Cool. That's great.
Yeah, he was really fantastic. And when the AP reporter got shot, I was out, and actually I got a call from Reuters saying, have you heard that Kathy Gannon was shot? And I was like, no, my God, because Kathy Gannon is a friend. Yeah. And I went back, and Kathy Gannon is an old friend of my house. And he was already finding out everything. He had called the governor of wherever the hell it was that she was shot. He was finding out all the information. And we sat down, coordinated together, and just made sure he was set. Yeah. And he's a really good guy. He's definitely a very, very good guy. Also very well connected.
Right.
Don't ever lose him. Don't ever lose him.
Okay. I'm trying to just send invites to people again through the tool. Would the two of you want to start? And
well, you've got 6 other people besides yourself.
Yeah, they're just watching right now. So
well, let's start, because they're going to get bored.
Yeah. So maybe just start by introducing yourself. I'll continue to just add people this way, and we'll see if we can get other people to join.
Cool.
Let me see.
We should probably join before the 6 who are on start to drop off.
Yeah. There we got. There's Linda. So, all right. Yeah, if you guys want to start, we'll.
Should we start talking?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Steven Springer. I'm Senior Executive Producer here at Voice of America, and one of my major responsibilities here has to do with best practices, standards, and ethics in journalism. And sitting to my left is Sharon Behn from our central newsroom.
Hi everybody.
Why don't you tell them a little bit about what you've done?
I've worked for VOA for 5 years. I worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a bureau chief for 2 years. And before coming to VOA, I have been a global correspondent. I've been to East Africa and Iraq and Central Asia, Russia, Latin America, many other different places. And I've worked with different organizations. So I come with a background of many different kinds of media organizations.
I've been with VOA for a little over 6.5 years. Actually started out here as the managing editor for our central newsroom and moved into my current position, almost 5 years ago now. I spent 23 years at CNN. Most of that was working on special events, big coverage, but my last 2 years there was working in the Standards and Practices department at CNN, which kind of led to me doing this work here. So it's something where I'm in contact with all of our language services, central news on an almost daily basis, just making sure that we're doing the best job we can as journalists to be as honest and as fair in our reporting as we possibly can be. Just to a little visual aid, there's we have what's called the Best Practices Guide, which is about 90 pages. I update it regularly. It goes out to all the journalists at VOA, both here in Washington and overseas. We post it on our internal website so everybody can have a copy. And it's basically, the reason we call it a guide and not a manual is because, as you can probably realize, the lines in terms of what constitutes best practices or ethics keeps changing now day to day. Digital has changed things so much. It's more of a guide to point people in the right direction rather than a manual that says you must do this. If I told you how many times I've updated this thing and had to revise it since I first wrote it in 2011, I think I know I've lost count. But it's meant to be sort of a map, a guide for everyone to follow the best rules of journalism. If any of you have any questions, I know we have one that's come into us in advance, but if any of you who are on would like to ask either of us a question about how we do what we do and how we try to follow the best practices and ethics in journalism, please speak up. We're happy to answer.
And there are some sort of basic ethical guidelines that all journalists follow, including freelancers and stringers, which are, they're very basic. They seem obvious, but you don't make things up. You don't attribute quotes to someone who didn't say it. You verify the information as much as possible. And I think the reason ethics are so important to all journalists is that it does a couple of things. It establishes very clear work lines. And you need that. You need, especially in the field when things can get a little fuzzy, you need very clear work lines. You need to understand what is considered ethical and what isn't. And second, I think ethics are very important because that establishes the credibility of your information and the credibility of your organization. If at some point you start to, if you have journalists who make things up or things aren't reported accurately, your news organization is going to lose credibility with the public, and you as a journalist will lose all credibility. And that's basically it's your reputation. It's what you are based on is that. So I think it's key. It's absolutely key that you have clear guidelines, that you establish that you are a credible source, and that your organization is considered a credible organization. I think that's sort of why ethics are so important.
And to add on to what Sharon just said, with VOA, because we broadcast and we print online in 45 different languages, for us, what I guess I would call the trickle-down effect is that, yes, it affects your credibility as an individual. It affects the credibility of your particular language service that anyone works for here. And yes, it affects the agency, and it can really hurt our reputation globally. And we're not, if it affects one region or one country or one service, that has a ripple effect for all of VOA. So we have to be really certain that when we're reporting, and on some of the stories we're reporting, whether it's from Africa, whether it's from Europe, whether it's from the Middle East, we have to make sure that the information we're providing is as accurate and as fair as it can possibly be.
And I think that some of the questions are, you know, how does this come up within a news organization? And I've worked for many. I've worked for wire services. I've worked for newspapers. I've worked for VOA now for a number of years. Different organizations have different standards. They're not very, very different, but some are more stringent than others. So, for example, I worked for one newspaper who said, you know, if you are a member of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCA, for example, you had to actually declare that to the administration of the newspaper. You had to tell them, I belong to this organization, so that they knew that, you know, you may be biased in that direction. They wanted to know if you had any biases, and you had to declare that. So some organizations are extremely strict. You have to tell them, look, I belong to this, I belong to that, so that they know, well, maybe she shouldn't report on this particular subject. Maybe we should get someone else to report on that subject. And so, you know, some of them have very, very clear guidelines as to who, you know, what information you have to give the management of your newspaper. On the other hand, I've also had newspapers that went way overboard, and they said, if you even have a cup of tea with someone that you're interviewing, that could make you biased. Don't ever accept tea or drinks or anything. And frankly, for someone who's been in the Middle East many, many years, it would be offensive. It would be insulting not to accept tea. So I you know, in those situations, I was thinking, you know, I don't agree with those guidelines. I think at some point, you're an adult, you're a responsible journalist, you know where the guidelines are, and, you know, accepting a cup of tea is not going to bias your story. But these are things to consider. You have to keep in mind, am I going to be biased? Can I keep a clear mind? Can I stay objective? And in the field, that can get very complicated.
And to add on to that, I mean, one thing that is said in the guide very early on is essentially, as a journalist, you have to keep your personal feelings, your personal opinions, your political affiliations, and your religious affiliations out of your reporting, out of your work. None of that can be an influence on your work. For instance, right now in social media, if I were to go onto my Facebook page and continually post articles that are critical of the Republicans in Congress, my Facebook page says that I'm the senior executive producer for VOA. You could take the opinion that Steven Springer is a Democrat, likes President Obama, can't stand the Republicans. Can't do that. You have to make sure that you leave all of your personal opinions out of it. I have no idea what Sharon's affiliations are politically. Our national correspondent who reports on the presidential elections and reports on Congress every day, I haven't any idea what his political affiliation is, and you wouldn't know from reading any of his work. And that's where you truly, that's a question of ethics. You have to be the honest presenter of the information to your audience. And it's crucial to be honest, because if they don't believe you, then you have no value. You have absolutely no value in terms of communicating information to anybody. So that's really key.
And actually, I think that's become a real challenge with digital media, with social media and so on, is you have your personal opinions and you have your professional opinions, and you need to keep those very clearly separated. You have to know that when you go on Twitter or on your Facebook or any other form of social media, you know, people know you as a journalist, so how much of your personal opinion do you put out there? And that can be very difficult, because sometimes some news organizations want you to write a blog, and they want your sort of personal input. So there's sometimes there's a fine line between how much personal input you put there and how much personal opinion. These can be very difficult things to sort out. But that's definitely one of the challenges of digital media, I think.
I've had this conversation with friends of mine who have been in the news business, have left, and are still in it. And it's something it's not written anywhere. You will never find it written anywhere, but I think Sharon's just really referred to it, in that at least here in the States, when you become a journalist, there's a certain amount of, I don't know if freedom is the right word, but you have sacrificed the fact that you do, as Sharon said, have to be careful about your professional work and your personal opinion. You sort of give that up a little bit once you're in the public space, whether it's Sharon appearing on camera as a correspondent doing a report from, say, Pakistan, whether it's if I wrote something for voanews.com and it's my byline by Steven Springer. Once you've done that, once you've become a public person, everything you do is public, and you have to be careful about that. You have to understand that there are just some things that you might have to keep to yourself. Going back to Facebook or Twitter, if I see an article, whether it's on VOA's website, whether it's in the New York Times, whether it's in the Times of London, whatever it is, if I post it to either of those accounts, all I will write is, this is an interesting article. This is worth reading. I don't tell you why it's interesting. I don't tell you why it's worth reading. I don't tell you my opinion of it. I've actually had people tell me that even just saying this is worth reading means that I've shown my bias towards this article, which is, Sharon was saying before, it goes a little bit over the edge. It's a little bit too much. So I try and present things for people to make up their own minds, because I know I am in the public space as a journalist. So here's the article. You make up your own mind about it.
Anybody have any questions? No?
We do have one that was sent in to us earlier from Maria in Ukraine, which is actually kind of interesting. It's how often do U.S. journalists suffer punishment if they violate the main ethical rules of journalism? And she continues to say that the thing is that in Ukraine, it often ends up with a magazine or a newspaper making an apology for posting false information, and that's all that happens. So what is the responsibility of a journalist for presenting incorrect information? Sharon, you kind of referred to that in your opening remarks in how you do your job as a journalist. Do you want to?
Well, I would think, first of all, that it's actually a very good step to issue an apology, and it should be on the front page of the website or the publication. Or some publications have it sort of on the first page down at the lower left. There's always one location, and it's the New York Times has issued an apology. They got the date wrong. They got some information wrong. There's nothing wrong with issuing an apology. It's an admission that you did something wrong, and that's a good first step. But as far as journalists getting punished, they do. They absolutely do. If you get caught out, if you get caught lying, or there's a New York Times, I think Jason Blair invented things. You are out of a job. You are never hired again as a journalist. You've ruined your reputation. You're done. You're finished. As far as the industry here is concerned, so I think the punishment is actually it seems to be a peer-to-peer punishment. You have let down the profession. That's not what we're about. Right. So I think the punishment can be sort of basically you're finished. You will not work as a journalist.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Sharon said. The other thing about incorrect information, and it's an interesting way of phrasing it as incorrect information, which is different than lying. If you interviewed someone and that person gave you information on which you're basing your piece, now it would be your responsibility, at least it would be my responsibility or Sharon's responsibility, to get information that confirms that you're not just taking that person's word for it. So, you might have to do a little bit of extra research based on that particular topic, whatever it may be. But let's say you didn't. Let's say you were working on deadline and person X told VOA or told whatever publication this, and you have a quote, you have this information. If it later turns out, whether it's a letter to, a comment posted or a letter or something that says, by the way, your reporter got that information entirely wrong and you should check here. Now, if someone gives us incorrect information and we don't double check it, yes, we made a mistake in doing that, and we will issue an apology or a correction. That's different than a reporter falsifying information, lying,
or putting something out there that they absolutely know is not true. Sharon mentioned Jason Blair. Back in the 80s here in D.C., the Washington Post newspaper had a reporter who did I think it was a 5-part series on a teenage drug addict. I can't remember his name, but her name was Janet Cook. She won a Pulitzer Prize, which is one of the highest awards one can receive in journalism or in any field. It later turned out that Ms. Cook made up the entire series, all 5 parts, totally fabricated, nothing real. She was fired. I have never heard of Janet Cook again, and it's over 30 years since that happened. So that is a very real consequence of falsifying information, lying, and just not being truthful. So that, yeah, I mean, that would be the best I could tell you about, what's the responsibility. You have to present correct information. Do all the checking that you can. Make phone calls. Look things up. The web is a little bit easy, and sometimes it's a little bit too easy to just put in a search term and see what Wikipedia says. You may already know this. Wikipedia is not necessarily the best source of information because anybody can go in and edit something in Wikipedia. Be sure you get to credible, solid, known places or websites to get your information from. Just be careful about how you're getting all of your information.
We have a question from Linda talking about ethical issues vary from country to country. And it's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I've worked in many, many different countries. I've also worked for Agence France Presse, where I was the desk editor, chief editor for all our Latin American correspondents and all the French correspondents. And what I noticed was that the Latin American correspondents had a particular writing style, and the French correspondents had a particular writing style, and that tended to be more opinionated and editorial than what is normally the English language journalist style. And at first I was a little disconcerted about it, but then I realized, this is exactly what Linda's bringing up. In Latin America, it is generally accepted that journalists present a point of view in their writing. In the French journalists, there seemed to be a variation, but there was also, it's almost like the journalists had a certain position in society where they could present something with a certain tone. In the United States and in England, that is not acceptable at all. And so, yeah, there probably are different interpretations or perspectives of what ethical journalism is. But overall, and regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, and I've dealt with many journalists around the world, there is an understanding that you don't lie, that you don't make things up, and that you always get a second perspective, that you don't only give one perspective on a story, that you always look to see the other side of the story. And it really doesn't matter where you fall and how you write it, but that is accepted everywhere. And there is an international code, and there's a freelancer code. You can go to the, I believe it's the Society of Journalism, the Committee for the Protection of Journalism.
CPJ, yeah.
CPJ has a code. There is an ethical code, and I really think that there are not really ethical considerations that don't apply. I think they all apply across the board. So that would be my answer to Linda.
And the other thing I'll say is that you can look at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Here in the U.S., we have the Society of Professional Journalists. We have various journalist organizations. And when I was putting this guide together, I looked at a lot of different organizations in terms of what their codes of conduct were for their journalists. And for the most part, as Sharon said, at least here in the States and in the UK, everyone is fairly consistent. We all have our own specific little concerns that we have to deal with based on the kind of organization we are. But when it comes to something that, as Linda put it, is a universal ethics code, yes, I would say it's universal. Our code of ethics, our best practices guide, We also have something called the Journalistic Code, which I think was written in 1994. What's curious about it is that it was written in 1994 and it only refers to radio, but the basic parts of it apply even 21 years later. And that is for every VOA journalist, whether you're staff, whether you're a freelancer, whether you're here in the States, whether you're in the Middle East, whether you're in Africa. It applies to anybody who is working for VOA in any capacity. Because if we're putting our name, the organization's name, on your report, we have to know that you're following the same ethical guidelines that we're following back here in DC.
I think there's also something else. Editors, it's not just journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Editors also need to follow an ethical code. They, sometimes an editor will tell you, I want this story, and I want it this way. And I have pushed back against editors and said, well, the story actually doesn't fall down those lines. The story is developing in this way. And they said, no, we want this perspective. And I'll be, well, I don't actually agree with you. I think we need to present both perspectives. I'm very respectful towards my editors, but I think that the ethical code applies equally to them, just as it does to journalists, equally to all of the management of any or a news organization, and I think that's important. I have, as I said, worked in many places, and I know, for example, I was on a bus once. We went to some press conference, and every journalist got presented a bottle of whiskey. And I actually don't drink myself, but I was so sort of taken aback, and I gave it back. I said, no, thank you. I don't want this. And it was a very strange moment, because you're making the person who's giving you the bottle of whiskey look bad. But I felt strongly enough about it that I was not going to accept this gift. I absolutely, all the other journalists did, by the way. But I couldn't. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And personally, I think that's a good thing. And I know it still goes on, and I know it's an accepted part of some cultures. I don't agree with it. I think it puts you in a very difficult position. It can compromise you in many ways, and I think at all costs it should be avoided. But I understand that situations can get very complicated in the field. Any other questions?
Another one from Linda.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm from the Kosovo group, and I would love to make one question regarding the blogging thing. There are a lot of journalists who are asked to actually blog or to kind of be part of editor, like make this a 1 week essay or opinion. And I mean, I would love to know, you mentioned something about it, but I would love to know to what extent should journalists play the part of being critics and being opinionists and analyzing things in a not journalistic way? Because if you write as a journalist, but then within the same week you also have this 1 week writing for your newspaper, it means that you're kind of just mixing up. I mean, people cannot take you seriously, and you cannot be objective, as much objective as you want.
I have a couple of suggestions on that, and I'm sure Ethan will have his own, but you can do a number of things with a blog. One, you can have at the top of your blog, you can say the views presented here do not reflect those of the organization or do not reflect my personal views, whatever you want. You can have a disclaimer. My understanding of a blog is to be able to present information that perhaps could not make it into your story. It's a number of personal observations, details, but not necessarily personal opinion. And I know that seems to be a fine line, but for example, if I were in Cairo, when I was in Cairo, and I was reporting on what was happening in Tahrir Square, I was reporting on what's happening in Rabaa Adawiya, and those were my stories, my TV stories and so on. But there were a number of very small personal observations that I had, of how you could move through a crowd, or a woman who put a scarf around my head, that wouldn't necessarily go in a story, but were interesting. I can put personal observations in a blog without actually putting my personal opinion on the blog, and I think that's how I would do it. I'm not sure if that helps you, but I think that's how I would do it.
Other news organizations, I know the New York Times is doing this more, and we've done it here on occasion at VOA, and I know that when I was at CNN we were doing it. On the video side, you can do something for a shorthand. Everyone calls it a reporter's notebook, and it's essentially the same thing Sharon's talking about. It just, maybe there was video that didn't make it into your piece. Maybe there was an interview you did. If you went to, say, Nepal after the earthquake, and you were with a group of children and their parents or something like that, and it didn't fit your piece, or there was more than you can put in your piece, you can write it, the reporter's notebook, in first person. When I met with so on and so on and so on, and you can give your audience more information on a more personal level, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give your opinion. People can learn more about you if you show them what you've done behind the scenes to a certain degree, which a blog can also do, than having to state your opinions outright. And like Sharon said, I don't know if that fits your situation, but I think that we agree that would be the best way to be able to get around it.
Right, so a blog would give a sort of more intimate, more personal view of what's happening around you, things that an audience, really may want to know. They may want to know, what you do. Very small details that give a kind of real immediacy to it. But it doesn't mean you have to say, I really hated this, or, I think so-and-so is blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do that. You really don't. It doesn't have to be, it can be a personal conversation without being a private conversation. And I think, those are the things that journalists have to be a little bit careful about. You are, as Stephen said, a public figure. People are reading this. You need to be able to maintain a certain level of professionalism and a certain level of objectivity, regardless of what's going on around you. We have another question about WikiLeaks, which is a very interesting question. And the question is that WikiLeaks released a wide variety of information over the years, and the media outlets around the world published the documents just like the WikiLeaks released them. They did not edit things out, for instance, the names of people. How ethical is this? That is a very good question. I found the WikiLeaks documents fascinating, and many of them were amazing. My personal opinion, and I don't know where Stephen would fall on this, but I would not feel comfortable publishing the names of people that I felt could have their life threatened by my doing so. And as a journalist, I have done that. When I was in Iraq in 2005, 2006, 2007, at the height of the sectarian conflict, I had many people saying, please don't publish my name. And I would put in another name and then say, I am using a different name because this person is afraid of being killed, I think as a journalist you have a responsibility towards the life and safety of others. Again, when you're in the field, this can be very hard to decide, but that's my personal opinion.
I agree with Sharon wholeheartedly. It's my personal opinion, and professionally, I don't think you would have, if I were to go back and look and go back to 2010, I don't know that you would find that any U.S. media organization published, shall I say, the sensitive names and information of people that were named in the WikiLeaks documents, precisely because of those security concerns. I would think that other countries may not have had the same concerns, especially because some of these, or the vast majority of these documents, put the U.S. and U.S. leaders in a negative light. So it might have been thought, well, we need to expose this. Here in this country, we have a slightly different view of that. And again, if it was going to be anything that was going to harm someone's position or where they're stationed or anything like that, I don't think there would have been any argument about that. we had a completely unusual and probably different experience here at VOA. I was the managing editor of our central newsroom when WikiLeaks broke, and we assigned only a certain number of reporters and editors, I think it was 5 total, who were the only people who could look at those documents online. And they were using computers that were wiped every day, separate laptops, apart from the regular computers we had in the newsroom, because of the sensitivity of that material. And being who we are, it was felt that we had to be able to approach this as carefully as possible. So there were not a lot of people here at VOA who were looking directly at the documents, at least not while they were in the building. And we took great care in how we reported those kind of things. So everybody, even though we said a few minutes ago, yes, there are basically universal ethical standards, in something like that, everybody needs to look at it separately. It's not as if we're all going to move in the same direction, and everyone's got to sort of do their own sort of institutional soul searching, is what I would call it, whether or not revealing names, revealing locations, revealing who they are and what they're doing is in the best interest of that individual or a particular government.
I also think there's a difference between revealing who wrote it, you know, Ambassador so-and-so, and revealing the name of someone, perhaps a local person, who's giving information on the understanding that he or she is remaining anonymous. That local person deserves to be protected. And I think that's where I would differentiate. If someone who's giving information, you know, if someone's life is at stake, you have a responsibility. Also, just to add on to what Stephen was saying, VOA is a government news organization, so it had a different set of responsibilities when it came to WikiLeaks. The Guardian took it totally differently. Other newspapers did it very differently. It depends on as he said, it depended on the institution how they approached it. Anything else?
Any other questions? Anything?
I think we're good then.
Do they want us to continue, or
No.
would you like to hear anything else? Anybody?
I don't know if you can hear me.
What about the ethics of publishing bloody
Oh,
images?
bloody images.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Bloody images and those kind of images, that's something, unfortunately, that we're facing more and more and more. We actually had, after the, when we got the video of the, was it the Jordanian pilot?
Oh, being burned alive, right?
Being burned alive. We knew immediately. Let me start with this. One thing that VOA, and again, I would say most Western news organizations that I'm familiar with, we will not be a platform or a mouthpiece to put out what those kind of groups are doing, to give them a platform on which to present their views. In other words, we got video, we saw the video of this Jordanian fighter pilot being burned in a cage. That's gruesome. That's horrible. That's despicable. We need to tell the story, and we need to explain it as carefully, yet convey the horror of what was done to this person. But we don't necessarily feel that it's a good thing editorially to actually show our audience that video. There are ways we could have handled it. We could have told the story on our main page and then said something like, you know, click through to see the video or something like that. But generally speaking, the immediate reaction was, we're not going to show this happening. It's just too horrible to show people.
I think that there's a, somebody else spoke about ethics of different countries, and again, I've worked and lived in many, many different countries. In countries like Spain, for example, they will show images of people dead on the ground. In Pakistan, they showed images in the newspapers of people being killed, shot, pieces of people being blown up and so on. That really differs from country to country, the level of violence that's acceptable in a newspaper or on a website, and that's definitely a cultural perspective. Some countries have a very high level of tolerance of that. The U.S. happens to have a very low level of tolerance for that. I have slightly different opinions on this subject. I think that when you're covering a war, it is sometimes appropriate to show the brutality of a war, because at times the home audience forgets just how brutal war can be, and to make it a sort of to make it look cleaner than it is, or make it look nicer than it is not an accurate reflection of how bad war can be. And I've covered many wars, so I feel that it is important at a certain level to show the brutality of a war. But as Steve said, there are different ways of showing this. You can write about it. You don't have to shove someone's face in it. And there's certain things that I feel, no, you don't have to show. You do not have to show someone's head being sliced off. You do not have to show someone being burned alive. To me, that's a certain limit that I personally could never cross. I don't think I don't think I've ever seen written down, you cannot show this, you cannot do this. Again, there's some things that are generally acceptable, and it does vary from country to country. I perhaps would show a little bit more than the general American public is willing to accept, merely because I think it's important. But, that is really up to each institution and how they, the New York Times may feel one way, VOA may feel another way, El País may feel another way. I guess I would do it that way.
And just so there's no confusion, I mean, I do agree with Sharon. When you're covering a war, whether it was in Iraq, whether it's some of the violence that we've seen in Africa, like in Mali before they had their elections last year, we were getting video from battle scenes. And yes, you don't necessarily want to have a close-up of somebody's head who's been, maybe been battered with a rifle butt and has been flattened. That's kind of gruesome. But if you're going to show, say in video, a wide shot, or in a photograph, a wide shot of, rebels came through this village and killed hundreds, and you see this devastation in front of you, I would probably be okay with that. I wouldn't be necessarily okay with something like what I just described. And in fact, I can give you a specific example of that. This goes back to when there was a civil war in Lebanon. So we're talking, this was April 1983, when the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon was bombed. I was working on the international desk at CNN at the time, and we were getting in a live feed of the scene outside the U.S. Embassy, rescue efforts, and we were putting it live on the air. We made it clear that this was unedited video. We'd not seen it. And as you were looking at the screen, there was a Red Cross worker or a Red Crescent worker clearly holding the back end of a stretcher. And as you're watching, the stretcher is coming into view across the screen. And as the full stretcher came into view and you got to the head of the stretcher, this person's head was flat on the stretcher. This person's brains were literally blown out of his head. And everybody in the newsroom at the same time went, "Oh my God, what is that?" And we went back to the anchors, and they quickly apologized, and we explained it was live television and so on. But that's really not something you want people to see. You've seen the devastation that the embassy's been bombed. You've seen wounded people. You've seen the ambulances. Something like that is almost too much to bear. And so, yes, there can be a level of that in terms of what you want to show. But there's something I want to emphasize. And the more we've been talking, the more I realize it. We're being given specific examples, and we're talking about specific examples. But what I want everyone to understand when it comes to making these kind of decisions, as Sharon said, it's not written anywhere that I've worked, you will not do this, or you will show that. Everything is decided as it happens. There is no blanket, umbrella, however you want to describe it, set of words that will tell you every time this happens, you will do it this way. That is not the case. Every time something like this happens, there is a discussion. People send emails, people will come and look at video, people will discuss it, and then a decision is made. Just because it was done one way this week doesn't mean it's going to be done the same way next week. That's really important to remember. You can have all the guidelines you want, but when something like this happens, no matter what it may be, whether it's devastation, whether it's sensitive information about an individual, the discussion has to happen. It has to happen with your colleagues, it has to happen with your supervisor, and if you're working for an organization, it may have to go to the top person in your organization. But it should never be, oh, a month ago I did it this way, so I'm going to do it this way now. Don't fall into that trap. That's dangerous.
We have another question about, don't you think journalists are always subjective to a certain extent, no matter how much they try to be objective? They choose people that they interview, they choose the frame, they choose the angle, they choose the things they will present. I'd like to talk to that. I've been a journalist for 35 years, and one thing I have learned, and this is extremely hard to do, is that yes, you can be objective, but you have to sacrifice your personal feelings in order to do that. And I have been in many different situations where I felt very strongly against a certain group, for example, and I had to put those feelings away and give that group the chance to say their piece. It is a question of training, a real question of training. It is not something that comes naturally. It really doesn't. And I have trained myself year after year after year, and I've made mistakes in the past, to stay objective, to remove myself and remind myself that my job is to give information to my audience and to give as balanced a picture as I can. I'm going to give this person's opinion, that person's opinion, perhaps an analyst's opinion, and it really doesn't matter what I think. I decide who I interview? Yes. Doesn't necessarily mean I like who I'm interviewing. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree with whom I'm interviewing. I've chosen the people that have a reputation in their field. I've chosen the people who may represent a certain community. That doesn't mean I like them at all. It just means that I'm going to interview them. They are part of that particular story, and I'm going to interview them. And I have interviewed many people whom I don't like, and many people whom I just don't agree with, and they would never know it. They would never know how I feel. I've presented their points of view and tried to make it as broad as possible. When you frame a picture, you're right. You can say, look at this crowd, right? You can focus in on a crowd, looks like thousands of people. When you pull out, well, there were only 100. That's ethical. You're making a bad decision. If there are only 100 people, you say there are only 100 people. You don't misrepresent by framing a picture. That's not correct. You don't misrepresent in a story by only picking the people that you want to talk to. This falls down on the ethics story. But as far as being subjective, you train yourself to be objective. You really do. And there's no way out of it. I want to add one more thing, which may go against what I just said, but I'm a woman. I'm a mother. I bring a perspective that perhaps a man and a father doesn't have. Does that make me subjective? I don't think so. I think it broadens my understanding of humanity. I've lived in many different countries. I think that broadens my understanding. I don't think it necessarily makes me subjective. I have requested to be taken off a story. And it was the Columbine massacre when a kid went in and killed a number of students at a high school here. I was covering that story daily. When it came to the funeral of the children, and I have children of my own, I could not cover it. I couldn't. My emotions were too high. It was a very, and I went to my editor and I said, I'm really sorry. I'm getting too emotional about this story. Please take me off the story. And I requested that. Take me off the story because I can no longer do this in a purely objective manner. And my editor was fine. He said, that's fine. I understand completely. He took me off the story. And I think that's something that you have to do. If you feel that you cannot do something objectively, if you feel this goes against something that you very strongly believe in, then either you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be honest with your editor and say, I cannot do this in an objective manner. There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As long as you're saying, hey, I can't do this. You do something else. Do something else. So you can use your personal experience to inform you, to make you a better journalist, to widen your experiences. But you have to train yourself to be objective. The moment that you feel that you can't do that, I don't see that as a negative thing. I don't see that as a failing. You just have to admit it and try to do something else.
A couple of things from what Sharon just said. One thing about working with an editor, and she said before that, you know, if an editor says, I want you to do the story this way. Related to that, if I were Sharon's editor and she was assigned a story and she's doing it, as she said, she may come at it from a certain perspective and I may be viewing it from a certain perspective, but the bottom line is when she turns in her script, we have to come to a meeting of the minds. And what my personal experience is and what her personal experience is should not get in the way of that approval process. It needs to be an open and honest discussion about the script, about the story, not about her personal feelings about the story and not about my personal feelings about the story. So there is as much emphasis on an editor not bringing his or her personal bias or feelings into the script approval process. It's equal to how the journalist has to approach that script. Sharon said something also about training and recognizing what's ethical and what's the right thing to do. And it reminded me of something else that happened during my time at CNN. This is the late 80s when Manuel Noriega was the president, I guess. That was his, I think, honorary title of Panama. And going back and forth with the United States over control of Panama and democracy and so on. And CNN had sent a reporter and a producer and a two-person camera crew down to Panama. And at that time, we knew that General Noriega could see CNN US in his headquarters. We knew that. We were doing a story, and the reporter interviewed two people who were pro-Noriega, two people who were anti-Noriega. He fed in all this raw material. They fed it all in. I talked to the producer on the phone who was with him in Panama City, and I produced in Atlanta a package. Maybe it ran 2.5 minutes. I don't remember. But it had sound, you know, it had an equal number of sound bites, pro and anti-Noriega. I left for the evening. I came back in the next morning about 11 o'clock. And I was told that I immediately had to go to our executive vice president's office, and I'm thinking, what is going on? He laid into me, and I said, what's the problem? Our entire crew was being kicked out of Panama because the piece they saw this morning in Panama, in Noriega's headquarters, had only one soundbite in it, and it was one of the anti-Noriega people. So our entire crew had to get out that day. And I said to the executive vice president, that is not the piece that I produced last night. And I literally had to become a detective. I had to go back to the editor, the associate producer, the show producer, and then I found out it was the executive producer of a particular newscast that morning who decided that the piece that I had edited the night before with my editor was too long, and he wanted a shorter piece. So he cut it in half, but had absolutely no regard for balance, objectivity, both sides of a story, and essentially he was to blame for our crew getting kicked out. He got suspended for the rest of the week. He did not come to work the rest of the week. So going back to what we were talking about very much at the beginning of this, yes, you can be punished for messing up. And if you're not trained to understand how to do these things and to be fair, to be ethical, yes, there are consequences. There's no question.
Question from
How do you know you've chosen a good or true representative of a group?
That's okay. So the question is, how do you know if you've chosen a good or true representative of a group? It's a good question. Usually a group will have a named representative anyway, whether it's Amnesty International has a named representative or chief of that group. A rebel group will normally have a rebel commander. I'm trying to think of different kinds of groups. And any group normally has a nominated spokesman, a nominated spokesperson who will speak for that group. If there's dissension, if there are divisions within the group, and you know that, you may want to find out who else is in that group who's willing to talk to you. If there are divisions within the group and nobody's willing to talk to you, it is your responsibility as a journalist to say there are reported divisions within the group, but no one's willing to speak to it. There's nothing wrong with saying that. If there's a story that's not clear, that's full of contradictions, one person says this, one person says that, and you're really not clear, your job is just to say it's not clear. There are many different opinions on this particular subject. It's not your job to pick one and say, okay, this is the clear one. What you're trying to do is tell your audience, this is the reality of the situation. So if the reality of the situation is that there are many different voices and there are many different contradictions, say it. Just say it. So-and-so said this, but so-and-so said that, and this person wouldn't even talk. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with telling your audience, what you're experiencing. And I think this is something else, is that we can only report what we see. We can only report what we're informed, and we try to get as much information as possible to make sure that it's accurate. As Steve said, you get a second source to make sure that you're verifying, and that's part of your responsibility. Somebody tells you something wrong, I'm going to go verify this. I'm going to double check. I know he said that, but I'm not quite sure I trust him. I'm going to go double check. That's part of your responsibility. It is also, you have to understand, you're not. You're just human. You're just human. You can only give that particular chunk of reality, that particular piece of reality. And there's nothing wrong with saying when you're reporting, that this is only this piece of the reality, that there are other things going on. There's nothing wrong with saying that. I think that's important. I covered a war, a civil war, where I was only traveling with the rebels. And I was a very young reporter, very, very young reporter. And at that point, I did not say there's a whole other side to this war. I just left it out of my report. It was one of the biggest lessons I ever learned, was when I got slapped by well, not physically slapped, but I got metaphorically slapped, saying, why didn't you present the other side? Well, I actually was only 26 years old, and I was too stupid. It's been many, many years since then, and now I know. There's nothing wrong with me saying, this is what I saw, however, this has been reported from the other side. I didn't know the other side. Now, these are the things you learn as a journalist, and sometimes you learn on the job. So now I know I can say this is what I'm seeing, however reports are that, this is what's happening on the other side. That's perfectly fine. You don't, it's fine to say that there are contradictions and differences and things that are not jiving with what you're getting. I hope that helps. I hope that clarifies a little bit. Did it?
Anybody else? Any other questions?
That's it.
Thank you all. Thank you all. I hope we've helped you, and good luck. Thank you.
Bye.